Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we are attempting to give our Olympian judgment of all subjects, history, religion, and culture related. Of course, today we're wanting to call this a humid day, or a rather sticky day on Olympus, as we're feeling a bit warm. Anyway, moving on with what we've got. So today we're starting a brand new series that we're very excited to introduce to you all.
Yeah, this is just a mini series, really on the subject of apologetics, but we didn't want to call it that because a lot of people don't know what that is. And I'm riffing for the title that we have picked from the statement of a well-known apologist, more about him in a few minutes, some years ago, who, when commenting on the state of knowledge of a lot of the ministers in his own time, we're talking here 1960s, 1970s, he said, they think they have the answers. They don't even know the questions. Because this is a problem that's still with us, that seemed like a good title to have here. If Jesus is the answer, you better know the questions.
Yeah, I may know what apologetics is, but some of our audience might need reminding. So, like the title says, what is
Well, they've
apologetics?
just got to listen for the rest of this hour, haven't they? And then they'll know. But very, very briefly, apologetics is about relating the Christian message and Christian ideas to reason, however reason is conceived or understood in whatever society one happens to be speaking to, or whatever subculture or subgroup. I mean, we see this going on really, really early, and people who've been going to church half their lives will already know what I'm about to say, but let's just remind them and perhaps tell the others. Even the four Gospels are generally understood to have been addressed to different kinds of audiences. Matthew's Gospel, in the way that it's set out, is clearly aimed at a predominantly Jewish audience. Loads of Old Testament practices and ideas and phrases are not explained. The way the thing is structured is deliberately designed to remind people of Moses coming down from the mountain. So the Sermon on the Mount is structured around that idea. Mark's gospel appears, this one is less certain than the other three, but it certainly appears to be aimed primarily at a Roman audience. It's widely believed to have been dictated to Mark by Peter, who was in prison, but it doesn't have all of the speeches that the other gospels do. The Romans like action stories, so loads of the long discourses are kind of cut out, and it's all main events. Luke's gospel, it seems to be aimed primarily at Gentiles. It's doing the opposite of what Matthew's doing. It doesn't mention too many Jewish expressions or practices, and when it does, it always explains them. And some of the stories that Jesus is recounting, it's generally the non-Jew that ends up on top, as it were, in the story, whether it's the Good Samaritan or anything else. And John's Gospel appears, and I think we mentioned this in a previous episode in one series or other, perhaps the early church, I'm starting to forget now, appears to have been aimed at the sort of people who were affected by Neoplatonic ways of thinking. It sounds a little mystical. You can't, unlike the other three Gospels, you can't just sit down and read 6 chapters at a stretch. You'll get serious indigestion. You have to chew on each phrase and this kind of thing. So they're doing it. And apologetics generally is about that idea, relating the Christian message to what counts as reasonable to the audience that's being addressed.
So, are we aiming this series at Christians in particular, or is this still for a wider audience?
Well, we're aiming at both, as pretty much all of our material is. Christians are most likely to have pricked their ears up, but if people who are not Christians want to listen in as well, either to give serious consideration to Christian ideas or to find out what perfidious things those dreadful Christians have been up to while they weren't watching, That's all good by us. Listen up, either way, people. So, yeah, good question.
I think I've heard you say before that really all Christians should feel the responsibility of being comfortable being able to express apologetics or witnessing in some sense.
Yes.
But I still feel like there's just a lot of Christians that don't necessarily, well, especially Western American Christians who don't feel comfortable necessarily with that. So is this series going to be helpful for them, do you
Well,
think?
I certainly hope so. But before criticizing anybody else, people like me need to be darn careful because there's a tendency, and it's not just academics, but people generally are like this. They spend half their lives tut-tutting because everybody else isn't like themselves. And certainly Christian academics can spend far too long tut-tutting that other Christians are not nearly academic or intellectual enough, and they can't be and won't be, loads of them. Most of them certainly could be a lot more than they are. That's a fair point. But loads of them are not going to be able to do that, and they've got other things to do with their lives, going out being accountants or serving in coffee bars and delivering the mail and a whole load of other useful things that you couldn't do without. So, we need to quick reality check there. But nevertheless, apologetics understood in a very general sense is something that really is for everybody, as we will see in a few moments. Well, let's start here with a beautiful quotation from Austin Farrer, who was Church of England clergyman and a friend of C.S. Lewis. And he points out that apologetics may not be sufficient for people becoming Christians, but it is necessary. It's a necessary condition, even if not a sufficient one. All right, here's what he says. It's commonly said that if rational argument for Christian faith is so seldom the cause of conviction, philosophical apologists must largely be wasting their shot. The premise is true, but the conclusion does not follow. For though argument does not create conviction, the lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument doesn't create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. And that seems to me to be getting things exactly right. I mean, I'd be hard put to think of anybody that I know or know of who became a Christian entirely on the basis of rational argument. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, maybe. But I mean, he's dead, and I can't ask him. I get that impression, right? And there's probably a few others out there, right,
So
including in the present.
basically, what he's saying is even though not many people are converted to Christianity simply intellectually, that doesn't mean that the intellectual arguments don't matter.
Right. And again, as long as we're understanding intellectual in its broadest possible sense, in a sense that embraces basically anybody who can make an even half coherent argument for anything at all at that level,
Right.
then this does matter. Yes. We gave the example a moment ago of the Gospels, which were aimed at different general audiences, and with the arguable exception of John's Gospel, you can't say that any of them were aimed specifically at intellectuals. They're things that anybody could read, and even if they can't read, could at least listen to and understand. So, yes.
What about there's a specific subculture of apologetics I feel like that exists of people who really want to um, get into the nitty gritty of proving that God exists and all of the different ways that you can supposedly going about doing that. Is there any room for that here, or what do you think about
I
that?
mean, think there certainly is room for it. I'm I'm not sure how persuaded I am of how far those arguments can go myself, actually. I mean, the classic case is Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God. And when you look at them, they boil down to, they tend to repeat one another. There's about 2 good ones in there, and the other 3 are kind of, yeah. This sounds awfully like the other one, phrased a slightly different way, that sort of thing. Yeah, I would say that I'm not sure whether one can prove God's existence except in a negative sense. And we'll come back to this perhaps at the end of this session, this episode today. That is that if you rule out the existence of God, then our total experience of the world, including this conversation right now, doesn't make any sense. It's much more coherent. If we want to give credence to our own thought patterns, to say, well, then there has to be something outside simply of us as an animal existence. That's a slightly complicated argument I'm not going to go into here. We might in one of the later episodes. But yeah, so I think I'd want to put it in that negative kind of way. Yes. Well, let's start off with a rather strange episode. Perhaps very familiar to some people, though probably not to most. And it's something that happened in the 1960s with a rather remarkable Canadian missionary, Don Richardson. His book, Peace Child, became a phenomenal bestseller. He was, I don't think he was a towering intellect or anything, he was certainly very smart. And he had trained in Prairie Bible Institute in Canada and ended up going with his wife as a missionary to the Sawi people in Irian Jaya, Western New Guinea, which is part of Indonesia. It actually wasn't then, it was part of the Dutch East Indies, but it was about to become Indonesia as it became independent. And he contacted this previously unreached tribal people, the Sawi, who were really rather ferocious and warlike. So he was risking his life just by getting in touch with them at all. But he did it, and they accepted him, and he lived among them, and he learned their language, which was extremely complicated. I just found out actually the other night that it has 19 tenses, which is a lot. I mean, English has more than most languages, but 19, I never counted those in English, but I doubt we'd get past about 10 or 12. But that's a lot. So he worked among them, learned their language, and was accepted as part of the tribe. We're talking here about 1962 to 64, this kind of period of time. And eventually he felt that he had earned the right to tell them his story, and he started to explain the gospel story to them. And they all listened, and it all went wrong because when he got to tell them about Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus, they all started to applaud. And he thought that he either hadn't explained it right or they'd misunderstood or something, and stopped and said, no, said it again, and they applauded some more. And what he didn't realise was, well, a couple of things. One, that among them, and they lived in a constant state of war with neighbouring tribes, it was considered to be the supreme art of a warrior to lull your enemy into thinking themselves secure and then to betray them and attack them at the last moment. That was considered to be a supreme martial feat, and that was what Judas was doing. So he had to just shut up for another few months and go away and think about it again. And eventually he realized there was a way of making real peace amongst these extremely warlike people, a peace that would actually be honored. And it entailed doing a rather terrible thing. And that was taking a child, a newborn child, from each tribe and exchanging them. And then one of us is now one of yours. One of yours is now one of us. And at that point, the peace would be made. And Richardson realized what he'd got to do. And he said, Jesus is the peace child, hence the title of his famous book. We were God's enemies, and God sent us the peace child so that we can be reconciled to him. And from that, the dam burst, conversions followed, the Sawi became Christians. So it's a very dramatic and stirring story.
Wow. Yeah, and I read this quote of his the other night that he says if a man would actually give his own son to his enemies, that man could certainly be trusted. And I think that's such a even, as a Western Christian living in America, that I feel like that's such a powerful statement about who God is and my own relationship with him.
Right. Yes. Yes. So he'd found the way in a way that made sense in their culture. But I mean, all of us have got immediately to admit that's pretty distinctive, right? Um, Things aren't going to work that way outside that culture. It's going to have to be something else. But so why are we telling this story? So that we get hold of the idea right at the beginning that what's going to count as reason in one society won't cut much ice in another one. But also, we're drawing attention, and this is a point we'll come back to in a few minutes, to the limitations of apologetics. Because if that was all he'd taught the Sawi, boy, would they have a distorted idea, right? So this was the way in, and then he has to give them a whole load of other stuff.
I feel like this makes apologetics a lot more complicated than some people want to believe that it is.
Well, it can be as complicated or as simple as we want to make it, I suppose. But the key thing is it must address what are the questions in the mind of the audience that you're speaking to. That doesn't mean you can make the gospel anything. You certainly can't. You've got no freedom at all to do that. But what you have got is a choice to present it in a way that they can hear. So the questions vary that people will bring in respect of Christianity by time and place. And the agenda is set not by Christians, but by those they're trying to reach or to persuade. So now this is something, again, that we talked about in an earlier series when looking at the early church. Look at Paul when he goes to speak in Athens at the Areopagus and tells them a whole load of stuff, and they all listen. It's all going absolutely fine until he talks about the resurrection of the dead. And then they all start to laugh at him and say, well, this man's an idiot. Right? Because in their way of thinking, the material world is inferior to the spiritual world, and the human body is simply a nasty, smelly prison for the soul. And life after death, sure, in some ethereal state, but the resurrection of the dead, that's just for the birds. Right? So he needed to find some way of getting through that somehow, getting past that. So the agenda is set not by us, but by those Christians are trying to reach, and generally appealing to what people already believe to persuade them of what they don't yet. So again, and this is stuff we looked at in that earlier series, Stephen in Jerusalem, he's talking to devout Jews. So what does he do? He reminds them of the Old Testament account that they already know, and then argues that these point to Jesus. Well, it doesn't go very well for him because they end up killing him. But even that fact shows that they understood him perfectly well, right? Paul in Athens got away with it just fine. They merely laughed at him. But he starts off by saying, "I can see that you're all very religious, but I saw one shrine around this place to the unknown God." Well, that's the God I'm going to tell you about. And so he starts going along that line. So it's an encounter between faith and reason, with reason setting the agenda, because what counts as reasonable varies by context, whereas faith is the given, the fixed thing.
Yeah, I feel like this means that apologetics becomes like a much more dynamic relationship, right? That you're having with somebody or with a group of people, rather than something that could be very formulaic. Or, I think a lot of Christians want to just have a particular formula or a list of bullet points that they want to go through, and then at the end of it, the person is converted, and it's miraculous.
Right.
But yeah, no, I feel like it requires this whole relationship and an awareness of who it is that you're talking to, and what they already believe in, like you said.
Right. Yes. I mean, I smiled there as you mentioned the sort of the person who's got their bullet points, and they're going to say these whatever, right? And nearly always, maybe I'm being mean here, but very very frequently in those contexts, they've got some idea of how to present this from back when they were alive, and never mind the fact that these young people or people in some other country or totally different context just don't talk that way or think that way. They're going to do this anyway, right? And of course, then they get frustrated when it doesn't work and come with us up with all sorts of spiritual reasons as to why, and so on. Certain kinds of missionaries in quotation marks, let us say, do this as well. They come with some pre-packaged formula that might have worked very well where they're from, and then they're determined it's going to work in some other country, and it doesn't. And then they want to start to say that that country's in deep spiritual bondage, and that's why it wouldn't work. No, you just weren't listening to them. You didn't learn anything about them. So I want to make a couple of subversive suggestions in this episode today. So let's start early with one of these, and that is that very frequently apologetics is adopting form to subvert content. So I give here two examples which might seem outrageously different or polar opposites to one another, but I want to argue that the same thing is going on. John's Gospel and Christian rock music. Right, let's talk about these two things. First off, in the early to mid first century, and for several hundred years afterwards, Neoplatonic ways of thinking, to simplify greatly, spirit good, matter bad, were becoming more and more widespread right across the Mediterranean basin. And what John's Gospel is doing is adopting this kind of way of talking in order to say the flat opposite. So it's slightly mystical, but right early on, he wanted to say, and the word, the logos, which meant something in Neoplatonic philosophy, is the idea of a link between the ethereal God and the nasty material world. The word became flesh. I mean, that's as offensive as you could get to those kinds of people, right? So, but he's adopting their way of talking in order to say the opposite thing. When he gets to the crucifixion, which again would be very offensive to people who think like this, even a holy prophet of God, let alone God in human form, in the flesh, dying, this would be impossible. And John's wanting to say, well, I saw him, right, and I saw the spear go in his side, and I saw water and blood come out. So he's emphasizing the physicality of this to a degree that the other gospel writers don't actually. So he's adopting the form of talking to subvert the content of that kind of discourse. Okay, let's scroll forward 1900 years. Right, and it's the 1950s and 1960s. And onto the scene bursts the irresistible appeal. It's a rather sensual appeal of rock and roll, and then later on just rock music, right? And it's impossible, certainly for anybody under a certain sort of age, not to feel the appeal of this music. But it does appeal quite deliberately to all of our animal sensibilities and quite often sexualized sensibilities, and certainly the abandonment of restraint and all of this kind of thing. And lots of conservative minded Christians thought this music was of the devil and were castigating it and what have you, and there were all kinds of intergenerational conflicts going on in homes and churches about all this kind of stuff. And finally, really by the late 1960s, some Christians decided to take the bit between their teeth and produce Christian rock music that adopted this form, this way of talking, this way of feeling, in order to say the precise opposite. Now, I got to say bluntly that most of that music was absolutely crap, but some of it was quite good. And of course, loads of leaders and a lot of older people in churches thought this was absolutely terrible, and this was, Antichrist coming into the citadel and all this kind of thing, But eventually, it won out, as indeed it had to do, because by the time you get to people of my sort of age, 597, since you asked, we just wouldn't have listened to 17th century English and 18th century hymnody and what have you, and everything being presented in that way. So a whole load of people, other people, came in, or in the case of people who were from Christian homes, stayed in, learned to dress down on Sundays, not up, and the whole ambience of churches started to change. I mean, I think that's all played out now, because nobody, I think, considers that church services that are basically a far too loud rock concert are somehow groovy and of the minute. They have definitely lost their shine. But that's because time has moved on again. But going back to the point that I'm making here, the advent of Christian rock music was adopting a particular way of talking, a certain kind of form, in order to say the very opposite thing. And that is very frequently what apologetics is doing. It needs to present itself in a way that a particular culture or people group or people in a particular country can understand and will listen to. But that doesn't mean that the core itself doesn't, that it shifts. Faith is the constant.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the modern equivalent for this now is like, the Christian TikTokers or the YouTubers who are using social media and these different platforms, right, to like get their message across to the multitudes. Wait a minute. Is that's not what we're doing here, is it?
Of course not. Of course not. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it's true. It's true. Well, this brings us to one of the dangers of apologetics, right? This activity is actually not safe. It's got to be done, right? There's no evangelism without it. It's almost the same thing as evangelism, but it's got inherent dangers because it's a skewed version of the truth. It presents only a currently convenient aspect of the truth. Think about what Don Richardson was doing with the Sawi. And there's a danger of marrying one's apologetic to the spirit of the age, like the Christian rock music thing. Right? You could be marrying your apologetic to the spirit of your country or society, as not a few missionaries have found to their cost, right? That they're simply viewed as cultural imperialists in another country because their version of Christianity is so closely married to the assumptions of the society that they're from. So there's a danger in that as well. Let's think about Neoplatonism and early Christianity. We mentioned what was going on in John's Gospel. By the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, a church father and philosopher, comes up with a brilliant idea that the Logos, mentioned in John's Gospel, is the same as the Neoplatonic idea of the Logos, the mediator between the spiritual God and the nasty material world. And he presents things that way to try and win converts. Unfortunately, that then gets built into the fabric of what later Christian leaders think. So it then becomes part of the faith itself. And in future generations they are on a bit more Neoplatonism and a bit more and a bit more, until by the time you get to the 4th century, early Christianity is almost unrecognizable because it's been so heavily Neoplatonized. Well, what about the pop culture of the 1970s? Now, this is going to sound a bit cartoonish. It's not quite true, but it's nearly true. People of my generation, and a whole load of them, became Christians at least partly on the basis that Jesus was a cool dude who could help us with our problems. Well, this is not entirely untrue. Just as it's not entirely untrue that Jesus could be the Logos as a mediator between God and humanity, just as it's not entirely untrue that Jesus is the peace child. Right? But it sure isn't the whole truth. Well, let's ask a question that is, as everybody listening or watching will immediately see, is not entirely hypothetical. What happens if a bunch of kids in the 1970s become Christians on the basis that Jesus is a cool dude who will help us with our problems? What happens if a load of those people, with the passing of time, as is inevitable, end up becoming leaders of churches? Will it create a situation in which loads of supposedly Christian preaching, loads of whole churches, indistinguishable from therapy culture? And of course, that's exactly what has happened. Oof!
Yeah.
Back in one of my many, many previous incarnations, when I taught in theological seminary in London, I would, when goading my students, which is my usual pedagogical method, ask them, who here is in favour of culturally relevant evangelism? Every hand in the classroom went up, yeah, culturally relevant evangelism. Good thing. Okay. Who thinks that syncretism is a bad thing? Every hand goes up, yeah, syncretism is a bad thing. What's the difference? Right? Because if you're not careful,
Oh dear.
right, those two things can basically become the same. Right? So, what point am I making here? That yes, we have to present culturally relevant arguments, but we can't leave it there. Once people have become Christians, they need to be given everything else, no matter how countercultural it is. And if we fail to do that, then we are creating mayhem for ourselves up the road. Witness the 4th century heavily Neoplatonized churches and theology and preaching and everything else. Witness our present situation with churches that are allegedly biblical but are actually therapy culture, and so on.
Yeah, and this, going back to the point that I already made, because I'm thinking about all of these different factors, that are really important, it can sound really overwhelming, to a Christian who now might look at this and say, well, I don't want to evangelize to anyone because there's an awful lot of ways that this could go
This could
wrong.
backfire.
And like I said before, that's why I think it's so important that we view apologetics as a more relational sort of dynamic, because you're not just trying to get in and get out with
Right.
somebody, but if you build a relationship with them, then you've got lots of time to address these different areas and show different aspects of the truth. And I really only say all of this because I personally struggled with the idea of apologetics for so long as a Christian, because I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna mess this up case,
Right.
but
Right.
giving myself a bit too much credit as a young Christian, probably.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, the relational aspect of this is something we're going to return to in the 3rd episode, right? So, because none of these things happen in isolation, you can be as relational as you like and get close to people, but if you never actually say anything, it's not going to actually
Right.
have that kind of effect. On the other hand, if you come out with all these heavy duty ideas and you're just blasting down at them from on high, whether intellectually or socially or any other way, again, it's just going to bounce off of people's heads. The whole thing needs to be meshed together. Yeah. And again, we need to recognize one another's gifts. Nobody is going to have all the gifts necessary to make this happen. And lots of people who perhaps not intellectual at all, they at least need to know the basics of their own faith and how to present at least a semi-coherent argument for that in terms that make sense in the society they're living in. And if they see people coming that way, then they should be willing to move them on to the pastor or to somebody else in the church who can then fill them in with the rest. And that goes right up to the level of leadership. And for this, I appeal simply to, well, we got Peter, and he's a fisherman, and he's smart enough, but he's no intellectual. And then you got Paul, and he's an intellectual. And the early church needed both, the input of both. Right? And the same kind of thing is true in leadership in churches as well. Right? One doesn't need to be some massive genius to be a pastor, but then pastors who aren't massive geniuses need to make a little space in their congregations for some people who are, without feeling threatened. Cough, cough. Right? And again, people who are some kind of intellectual shouldn't think that somehow that gives them, well, even access to the pulpit, let alone a monopoly on it. We need to make way for one another here.
Yeah, I think too, another message that I hear a lot of Christians throwing around these days is, well, we should be living in a countercultural sort of way. The things that we say and do should be, it shouldn't look like the current culture at all. And I just feel like to be irrelevant is not always a great approach either.
Well, I think one can be countercultural without being completely irrelevant. Again, I mean, you're right. It's a case of holding these two things in balance, isn't it? Yes, yes. I wrinkle my nose a little bit when people bang on too far about being countercultural, because I've always got this lurking suspicion that once they've ended up defining what they mean by countercultural, it's going to align perfectly with their personal politics. And it might be right wing or it might be left wing, but they'll insist that it's countercultural. So, yeah, I've learned
Yes.
over the years to smell a rat early on, because there's so many rats around. Well, okay, but if what I've been saying sounds like a counsel of despair, I mean, I don't mean that at all. So now this next slide here is like a paragraph taken from an essay of mine on apologetics, to which we're going to provide a link in the comments in YouTube and Spotify. So, what alternative do we have? What should the churches of the 1970s have done? Should they have ignored the cultural climate all around them and continued trying to perpetuate the preaching styles of the 19th century, the hymns of the 18th, and the King James language of the 17th, all conducted in musty, uncomfortable box pews? Should Justin Martyr have ignored the questions of the people around him and taught Gentiles to be good Jews, even though they'd hardly understood him, much less responded? Should Don Richardson have left his clever ideas alone and tried to turn the Sawi into shirt and tie wearing graduates of Prairie Bible Institute like himself, and simply have shouted down their protests that Judas was a hero and Jesus was a dupe? I mean, the answers to these questions, I take it, are obvious, right? So yes, of course, we do have to do these things, but then we need to go further. Right. I said we were being a bit subversive. Here's the most subversive conclusion of all. Whilst we must make apologetic arguments, we must never fall into the error of believing them ourselves. No, relax, everybody. Of course, I don't quite mean that. I'm just making a bit of fun, mostly of me, I suppose.
I always knew you were a bit of a bad man.
Well, yes.
But you're not saying that we should be downright
Oh, of course
dishonest.
not. Of course not. No. But I do. I like to think of myself as a bad man, really. But yes, no. Of course, we shouldn't. We shouldn't be dishonest. What am I really saying? Then, being serious here, I'm saying that yes, of course, we need to make these arguments, but we need to be conscious, even as we are making them, that they are a skewed version of the truth to win an audience for now. And as we get people there, then we need to take them a whole load further, or we're creating disaster further up the road. It might be 10, 15 years up the road when these people have finally become leaders or something like that. But disaster it will be. Let's take an example that applies to pretty much everybody in postmodern Western societies. If, as is commonly claimed, postmodernity is an attitude of incredulity to meta-narratives, that's the classic definition.
And meta-narratives being...
Meta-narratives being, in the deathless phrase of Douglas Adams, an explanation of life, the universe, and everything. Right? A big story, a meta-narrative that claims to explain everything, right? And postmodern people are incredulous when confronted by meta-narratives, whether they are religious, philosophical, political, anything else. They just don't believe them. With some reason, I might add. Okay, so if, as is commonly claimed, postmodern people have an attitude of incredulity to meta-narratives, then we will need to present the faith in bits and pieces in order to get a hearing. We're just going to have to do that, right? Zapping someone with your 4 spiritual laws from your little booklet or Journey into Life or something is just not going to seem credible to anybody, really, right? Not going to work. 1950s, 1960s, maybe. Now, no. But woe to us if we forget that the faith is a grand narrative, the content of which at some point, later if not earlier, we have to transmit to those who are becoming Christians, right? So, yes, presented in bits and pieces, we have no choice, because listening to some grand narrative, well, they're not going to listen, and that's the end of it, right? But if Christians themselves forget that their faith is a grand narrative about life, the universe, and everything, then they're going to get into big trouble, right? They need to remember that, and as people start to become Christians, then they start to give them an awful lot more bits and pieces that collectively make up that narrative. Fail there, and we set ourselves up for disaster a few years up the road, where we're going to have churches led by people who are certain that this particular teaching doesn't need to fit with that one, and if they're in potentially conflict, it doesn't matter. We keep them apart. We deal with this over here and that over there, and everything's a bunch of techniques or something like that. And then we really will be in a fine old mess. Well, I realise this leaves loads of loose ends, and we're going to pick up some of those loose ends in the next couple of episodes.
A little plug to make people keep listening.
Yes. If this isn't the entire, that I guess is our. I can't remember what the right word is now. Thing for next time, anyway, to keep people listening. So we're going to pick up on these. Next week, we're going to look at 3 very influential apologists of very different kinds in the 20th century, whose ideas are still used today. I'm not sure whether all of them should be. One of them for sure, yes. The others I'm less sure about, but they remain very influential, and a lot of people will recognise the kind of arguments that are made. And in the last episode, we're going to look at the rather crazy situation we find ourselves in now and what on earth we do about it. So, but for today, that's it. Like I say, do follow through on the web link we're going to supply to my Substack article about this whole subject matter on YouTube and on Spotify. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week, everybody.
See you then. Bye, everyone.
Bye now.